Shabbat Shalom. Welcome again to another session of Bagels, Love, and Torah. We like to say, come have a BLT with one of the rabbis at Congregation Micah. Well, this morning, July 4th, we are looking at studying some of the great texts of the Jewish people from Chukat Balak. That would be the double Torah portion that our tradition assigns us. I'm Rabbi Philip Rice of Congregation Micah, and we welcome you virtually during this pandemic to sit back and hear the words, hear the texts, warm up our brains, and do a little learning. Perhaps something insightful might be shared. We begin, as always, with a blessing for Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Before we turn to our texts and our parshiot, our sections of Torah, we like to just, simmer a little in some other wisdom. This, as always, from a section recently of Floating Takes Faith by Rabbi David Wolpe, who writes that in the Talmud, Baba Batra, page 12b, Rabbi Jonathan teaches that, quote, from the day the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given over to the fools and to young children. That remarkable statement has been the subject of many interpretations. Judaism is a tradition of learning and interpretation, law, and more. A continuation of prophecy threatens to overturn important ideas and the tradition. What if one can arise and say, that is what God wants? A declaration from one who hears a message directly from God threatens the tradition. But given that caution, what is Rabbi Yochanan's message? What do fools and young children have in common? Is it precisely the irrationality of his statement that labels someone a fool? And young children are blissfully and splendidly unaware of the presumed limitations of rationality. Fools and young children are aristocrats of the imagination. So perhaps prophecy is tied to the ability to imagine the miraculous, the confounding, the impossible, and believe it can happen. The scientist and skeptic T.H. Huxley writes, no conceivable event, however extraordinary, is impossible. And therefore, if by the term miracles we mean only extremely wonderful events, there can be no just grounds for denying the possibility of their occurrence. Are miracles possible? When scientists, rabbis, fools, and young children speak with one voice, we should pay heed. Well, I miss your voices. I miss the voices of children at Congregation Micah. But I'm touched that so many of you are watching and trying to immerse ourselves in sacred words. So this was just by way of introduction. Let's do one more just to get that brain warmed up and ready to study this double portion from our tradition. Who attains the afterlife? Whatever redemption might be, the question of who can earn it preoccupies the Jewish tradition. It's a traditional way of asking what sort of life is considered exemplary in this world. As we might expect, great scholars and sages and those of exceptional piety are said repeatedly to inherit the world to come. But the rabbis are always more interesting and nuanced than we may suppose. In the Talmud, we read that a certain Rav Baroka once met Elijah the prophet in the marketplace. Visitations from Elijah are periodically recorded in rabbinic literature. Elijah brings wisdom and counsel to this world. Rav Baroka asks who of those in the marketplace will inherit the world to come, and Elijah points to two men. What's your occupation? Rav Baroka asks them, and they answer, we are jesters. Right? We make the sad laugh. And when we see two people arguing, we try to make peace between them. It's from the Talmud, also, Ta'anit, page 22a. To bring joy into the world is noble. The sound of study is not necessarily holier, than the music of laughter. Well, hopefully you'll laugh today, and hopefully you'll take part in some of the music that Miss Lisa Silver will offer after this YouTube presentation. In the meantime, I just want to conclude this welcoming session and say, honored that you're here. Can't wait to share more Torah with you. We're going to turn next to some sacred text. If you want to grab the text, we're in the book of Numbers, Parashat Hukat. It begins in chapter 19. By way of introductions, I'll say this. Maimonides. Don't be afraid. Don't panic. Most of the words in this little introduction are in English. I will translate the ones that are not. Maimonides is an acronym. It stands for someone's name. Moses ben, meaning son of Maimon, right? So I am Flip, son of Tom and Audrey. So Maimonides is also called the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, son of, right? So I'm the Rapan, Rabbi Pesach ben Musi, Anyway, so I say that because Maimonides was the leading rabbinic figure of his time, probably of all time. By the way, he was also a physician who wrote medical treatises on a number of diseases as well as their cures. And this is actually why I mention him as we start, because he placed healthcare first on his list of the top 10 most important communal services that a city should offer its residents. Which is why Reform congregations remain at the forefront of advocacy on behalf of insurance reform in the United States on a state and national level. Though none of us are sure that we will ever reach the healthcare promised land. Aside, we're a tricky community, us American Jews, and we are quick to complain and to criticize, and we often let our fears get the best of us. So this is not unlike our ancestors, as we will see, who wandered in the wilderness. Jews all over the world are continuing to read in these summer months about the 12 scouts that are sent to glimpse into the promised land, and they bring back samples of its wonders, but they also return with fear and disenchantment and despair. We have encountered the envious power and wealth of Moses' cousin Korach, who leads a rebellion to try to overthrow Moses. And then in this week's Torah portion, the blow comes closer to the heart. Miriam, the sister of Moshe, of Moses, the voice of his song dies. And Aaron, Moses' brother, partner, and the voice of his words dies. And the people whine for water, and out of rage and frustration and grief, Moses defies God's instruction and smashes the rock with his rod instead of just touching it or speaking to it to get water, and just like that, the dream dies. And Vayomer Adonai el Moshe el Aharon, God says to Moses and to Aaron, Ya'an lo ha'imatem lehakadsheni, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity, my holiness. Le'enei b'nei Yisrael, in the sight of the Israelite people, lo ta'avinu et ha'kahal hazeh, you shall not lead this community, el ha'aretz asher natati lachem, into the land that I am giving them. It's Numbers chapter 20. It's like verse 12. So this whole Bamidbar, this whole book of Numbers, of literally being in the wilderness, like many of us feel through this pandemic, it offers us, though, a guidebook, a guided tour through the human wilderness, the dark side of the human soul, we could say, as well as the communal wilderness of people, of all people. Its stories are not only heroic triumph, they are of failure and of dissension and of conflict. So they certainly speak to our community here in the United States today. That does sound like America, right? And it certainly sounds like American Judaism and its landscape. Bamidbar shows us the shadows and the fear, the envy, the despair, the anxiety, the infidelity, the rage, the anger. So as Leviticus lifts us up to holiness, Bamidbar sort of parades before us our endless capacity for impatience and for intolerance and for evil. We Americans quickly grow irritated with this sort of literature. We like our heroes sort of in white and our villains in black, frankly. And we don't want to be reminded of our own mistakes or our own evil. America, wrote novelist Henry James, is a hotel civilization, a hotel room. You leave sloppy and unkept in the morning, and you return in the evening, and you find it all neat and tidy. You never know, or you don't really ever seem to care how it got that way. Well, as Jewish Americans, we should care, and we should not avoid facing the messy dark sides, the shadows. At our own peril, teaches Bamidbar, we ignore the dark side. And the only way to the promised land, that's through the wilderness. And we know the trek is dangerous, and we want to know what's going to sustain us, what will keep us from turning back. And maybe the answer is in our Torah. We look next and more carefully at the text. Come on, you love it when I chant. I know you do. Baruch hu et Adonai hamivorach. Baruch Adonai hamivorach leolam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten ha'torah. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor. Zot hukat haTorah asher tziva Adonai lemor. Daber el bnei Yisrael. Vayihu elecha farah aduma tmima. Asher ein ba mum. Asher lo ala alecha a'ol. Untatem ota el azar hakohen vehotzi ota el michutz lamachaneh v'shachat ota lefanav. 3 lines, just so you hear it. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher natan lanu torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch ata Adonai noten ha'torah. So here we learn the ritual law that God commands regarding the Israelite people and the red cow without blemish, the red heifer. There should be no defect on it. And you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and it shall be taken out to side the camp, and that shall be slaughtered in his presence. And you take the blood and you spatter it around, and you got hyssop and cedar wood and all sorts of stuff. I'll let you look more carefully. I want to bring a midrash for the red heifer. A heathen once said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the things you Jews do appear to be kind of like sorcery. Yeah. I mean, a heifer brought and burned up and pounded into ashes. I mean, its ashes are gathered up, and then when one of you gets defiled by contact with a corpse, 2 or 3 drops of water mixes with these ashes, and they're sprinkled upon it, and then you're cleansed? So Rabbi Yochanan asks the heathen, he says, has the spirit of madness ever possessed you? And the heathen says, no. Have you ever seen anyone possessed by the spirit of madness? And the heathen says, yes. And have you ever seen what you people do to the man? Roots are brought up, and they are made to smoke under him, and water is splashed on him until his spirit flees. And then Rabbi Yochanan says, do not your ears hear what your mouth is saying? A man defiled is like a man possessed by a spirit. The spirit is a spirit of uncleanness. When water of lustration is splashed on it, it flees. After the heathen leaves, Rabbi Yochanan's students say, our master, You thrust off that heathen with a mere reed of an answer. But what reply will you give to us? Rabbi Yochanan answers, as you live, the corpse does not defile, nor does the mixture of ashes and water cleanse. The truth is that the rite of the red heifer is a decree from the Holy One, who said, I have set down a statute, I have made a decree. You are not permitted to transgress my decree. Thus, chapter 19, verse 2. This is the ritual law of the Torah commands regarding the red heifer. Interesting. Notice that the explanation that Rabbi Yochanan gives to the heathen with regard to the purpose of the red heifer is a little different than when Rabbi Yochanan addresses his students. What's the difference and why is it? Something to ponder as we begin the study and Torah portion of Chukat and then move on to Balach shortly. So just a midrash. I've got a few more as we keep moving along in our text. I want to share a drash, an interpretation next by Rabbi Rami Shapiro, a teacher, a mentor, a friend who has got quite a spiritual side. We'll see what he says about this week and the turning point in the life of Moses, the frustration over the constant complaining of the Hebrew people and the chance to enter the promised land lost. Next. So I'm taking a look at Numbers chapter 20, verses 7 through 12, which read, God speaks to Moses, saying, take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes that it shall give waters. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said to them, listen now, O rebels, shall we bring forth water from you from this rock? And then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock with his staff twice. And abundant water came forth, and the assembly and their animals drank. And God says to Moses and to Aaron, because you do not believe me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you will not bring this congregation into the land that I've given them. So, Rabbi Rami Shapiro tells us of the virtual Rebbe, Yerechamayal, he calls him, and he teaches there's a great mystery in this story. Water from a rock, while perhaps explainable in geological terms, is really symbolic. Water and rock are opposites, and yet each contains the other. To bring forth the fullness of a thing, to bring forth the living waters, even from something seemingly inanimate as a rock, we have to speak to it. We have to dialogue with it. We have to engage with it. So Moses fails to do this. Water comes forth, but he does it out of anger. And it is this that robs Moses of his future. And if we're to bring forth life from the world, we have to do so with patience and with coaxing words and not with anger. So let's take a look. We like to do what's called the Peshat, the Remez, the Drash, and the Sod, paradise. The Peshat, P in paradise, is the simple meaning. And here we read that God commands Moses to speak to the rock, but why does he order Moses to carry his staff with him? Could he be setting him up for an act of anger? Could it be a test again? In a sense, God is saying, you have the power of violence in your hand and the power of love on your tongue. Which will you use, violence or speech? How might you relate to your life and your experience this concept? We all get angry, but we've got a choice. Are we going to respond harshly or with kindness? Then there's a remez, paradise, right? The r and re, or the resh, the r sound, the remez, the clue. So what does the Torah tell us about Moses hitting the rock? That he did it twice. So wasn't it once enough to bring forth the water? Could it be that God would have forgiven Moses for maybe one hit, allowing for some of his frustration. The people were constantly complaining. Was the second strike like the deciding one? And Moses couldn't contain his anger for one strike and then consciously gave into it for a second time. So what does this say about anger? And what does it say about human beings' anger? Can we control the sudden arousal of strong feelings that anger causes? Or are we only responsible for what we do with those feelings once we are aware of them? A drash, an interpretation, the D in paradise. Both Moses and Aaron are sort of present in this act, but only Moses commits it. So why is Aaron punished, right? Like, what might Torah be telling us about innocent bystanders? Is there such a thing when one watches a violent event from the sidelines? Can we excuse ourselves for not stopping violence when we see it? Or is the Torah telling us once again that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers? And in this interpretive mode, who knows what the Torah's secret meaning is as we guess, but there's a lot of fractured in our society, and a lot of it's divided by race, and a lot of it's economic, and we're all innocent bystanders if we're not working to fix it. That's what this rabbi thinks. The sod in paradise. To get to paradise, you need to get to that secret meaning. Sod means secret. And so what might be the metaphoric or symbolic meaning in water from a rock? Water may be trapped in a rock formation, especially in the sort of flash flood prone desert. But what else could the Torah be teaching us here? What comes to mind when you think about images of water and stone, soft and hard, life-giving and seemingly inanimate? In what ways are we being taught that nothing is without water? Nothing is without life? That everything actually is animate, even if it seems inanimate. Like a book is inanimate, but the wisdom it contains. The Hasidic believe that even rocks can sing to God, right? That everything contains a spark of the divine, and therefore everything is enchanted. And enchantment, for some Jews, literally means containing song, right? Enchantment. So, can you hear the song of the rock, of the trees, of the grass, of the wind? And what does the notion of enchantment suggest about the nature of creation and our relation to it? And how might it be different now that we've experienced this pandemic time and it's had such a positive influence on our planet? Secret meanings? I don't know. More to come. People should really think before they speak. It's common sense. But judging from the number of miscommunications and painful verbal exchanges that occur really every day, it's not so common, even for Moses and Aaron in this week's parashah, Hukat. Confused by the people's bitter complaints and the lack of water, God counsels Moses and Aaron to speak to this rock so that it will bring forth water from the community, right? Numbers 28. And rather than using words, Moses takes his staff and he hits the rock twice. And the people have water to drink, but the leaders are reprimanded for not obeying God, at least not exactly as God had intended. And we learn that because they did not publicly show faith in God's ennobling or enabling them to provide water through the utterance of words, Moses and Aaron are punished, and the punishment is severe. They're denied entrance into the promised land. The perils of leadership. Had Moses lost his faith? Did he embarrass God? Did he forget that he was God's appointed messenger, the chosen one of the Israelites? Did he abdicate as the leader of the Jewish people? Look, Moses' anger certainly got the best of him. And rather than speaking to the rock, he is required Moses raised his hand and struck the rock, not once but twice. And so what's the reasoning offered by God? Because Ya'an, you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people. Therefore, lachen, you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I'm giving them. That's 20, verse 12. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch suggests that there's a link between these two terms, Ya'an and lachen, because Moses had a momentary weakness of emunah, of faith. The two leaders of the nation suffered the same fate as one that was meted out to the generation of the wilderness. So the latter were sentenced to die because they had lacked faith through their journey, and because of a terrible momentary weakness, again, the lack of strength and commitment, a lapse of patience, Moses and his brother Aaron suffered the same fate. Maimonides, mentioned him at the beginning, right, gives another reason for their punishment in his introduction to the Mishnah. Moshe and Aaron display anger that deviated from the means of patience, and such behavior in leaders is considered Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. So it was their frustration with themselves not being able to constantly satisfy the needs of the people that provoked their words of biting sort of sarcasm. Listen, you Morim, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? That's verse 10 in chapter 20. So there's a midrashic wordplay on Morim, which also means teachers, right? It's from Numbers Rabbah. It indicates another significant deficiency on the leader's part. It interprets Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron's reply as a rebuke to the people. Listen, do you presume to be teachers, daring to teach us? Who are your teachers? We would have expected empathy with the plight of even this stiff-necked people instead of sort of like this harsh response. Hence, for us, such an attitude hardly qualifies as an optimal communication and education tool, a model of empowerment to which students are encouraged to aspire. Knowledge, wisdom, passion, humility, these are prerequisites for educational leadership. I mean, what kind of example is Moshe Rabbeinu, the teacher of teachers, setting here? It's related to the nearly impenetrable mitzvah of the Red Heifer, which appears at the beginning of this portion. The ashes of the red cow are used to purify the impure, but they also make the pure impure. So in order to effect this purification, the priest has to take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson stuff. That's back in chapter 19, verse 6. And the Italian commentator, Sforno, teaches that cedar wood symbolizes pride and arrogance. Hyssop, a plant that grows very low to the ground, symbolizes humility. Scarlet, or crimson color, is combined with cedar wood and hyssop to symbolize that both arrogance and humility are sinful. So the Talmud, in Sota, page 5a, suggests that a scholar who has too much pride is as sinful as one who has no pride. For Sforno, this applies especially to one who must exercise leadership on behalf of the people. A delicate balance is required to stand between God and the children of Israel, to listen to both of them, to chart a proper course. In our day, too, it continues to be difficult to find leaders who are willing to come forward and help us. This is true in the Jewish community, too. I mean, the Jewish community leadership here in Nashville, Tennessee, we are among a generation of Jews, and we need them to heed the call, younger Jews, that is, of the wise words of Dr. Eugene Borowitz, who said, we seek a leadership constructed not primarily in terms of accomplishment, of plans, but equally in terms of humanizing effect on the people being led. For Moses not to enter the promised land after 40 years of seemingly successful leadership in the wilderness was a severe punishment. Imagine how he must have felt. The rabbis of our tradition stayed up late trying to figure out what transgression Moses had committed to deserve such a fate. And if we look closely at chapter 20, it reveals that God had instructed Moses and his brother to take the rod, assemble the community, and ordered it to yield its water But instead of speaking, right, he struck the rock. He also called the Israelites rebels and did the entire job without including Aaron, sort of as God had commanded him. We could stop right there. I mean, we could list many of Moses' shortcomings. He was impatient, he was angry, he was self-centered, he had a lack of faith. We can conclude that he failed in his role. But that would be a mistake because of the deeper truths in this story that can help us in our lives. While Moses was a great leader, he was an imperfect human being, just like you, just like me. And he made many of the same mistakes we make. I mean, here we are. This was a new generation of Israelites he was trying to lead, and he must have felt as if his entire 40 years were a struggle, almost were a waste. Even God agreed that they needed a new leader to enter Canaan, and it was easy for Moses to feel that he had failed. But the truth is that he was not a failure, he was a success. If we measure success by whether we leave the world better than we found it, he scored pretty high. If we measure success by how much we've done together to strengthen the Jewish people, he was a success without a peer. There used to be this line, getting there is half the fun. How we travel the journey of life is more important than the specific destination that we reach. And in our personal lives, our promised land should be neither acquiring a certain amount of financial wealth, nor having the most friends, nor a guarantee that we'll even enjoy good health. One might also consider the reason for God's consternation that resulted in Moses' nor Aaron's entry into the land of Israel. It has been suggested that the fate was sealed because they did not acknowledge God's role in the miracle of water flowing from the rock. Aaron Wildavsky, a modern commentator, writes, at Meribah, that's where it happened, Moses substitutes force for faith. If Moses' great leadership quality is his ability to identify with the people, then the lack of faith at Meribah is a double one. Moses not only distances himself from God by doubting the adequacy of God's work, but also distances himself from the people by assuming power that was God's. Spiritually, he, Moses, has gone back to slavery, as if to replace Pharaoh. Moses' greatest mistake, actually, the reason he's not allowed into the promised land, is his overestimation of his own worth and power. Are we so different? How often do we reach a milestone in our lives and forget to thank the people who have helped us get there? Do we always remember that it's not really possible to accomplish a great task without some assistance from others? Moses really did reach the promised land, right? He didn't actually enter Canaan, but he brought his people right up to the edge. And despite his shortcomings, he was a remarkable leader, and he led a terrific life. So it is with us, even if we experience loss or disappointment. If we live ethical lives, if we spend time with the people that we love, if we direct our talents and our resources to where they're needed most, if we sanctify our days, then we too can say that the Jewish tradition has led us to the promised land. Stay tuned for a Devar Acher. Speak up and speak out. That's what Amelia Diamond writes. She's looking at chapter 20, verse 2. It's called The Community Was Without Water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. In Hukat, the Israelites find themselves in the midst of quite a bit of drama. Miriam dies. They get real thirsty. Moses disobeys God's commandment to speak to the rock instead of striking it. God gets mad and tells Moses and Aaron they won't enter the land of Israel. Aaron dies. And then they all battle against some Amorite kings and their armies. Whew! For just 2 chapters of Torah, that's a lot of action. And in fact, this is one of the most action-filled portions in the book of Numbers. The Israelites are faced with some tough questions. Who do we listen to? Who's our leader now? Whom can we reach out to for help? But the problem is that we don't actually hear the words or the voices of the Israelites. We are only imagining what they would have been saying. They experienced the death of major leaders, war, shocking news about Moses, and there's not a peep out of them. Are they scared? Do they want to break off on their own? The Torah does not offer us the voice of the people, except for the occasional complaint or exclamation. The easy explanation might be that Moses or Aaron or Miriam or even God speaks for the Israelites. expressing their concerns or their needs, that these voices are symbolic and therefore easier to understand. That doesn't quite sit right. There were, according to the Torah, hundreds of thousands of Israelites, and we know Jews tend to have opinions. But the kvetching about water, how did they feel when Miriam died? I mean, did they mourn Aaron? Do they trust Moses? There's no way they didn't have something to say. It's easy to see where the voice of the people can get lost in the shuffle. The newspapers report on what politicians, academics, and leaders say, but we rarely hear from the people, the ones experiencing the events in the headlines, the ones who most intensely feel the impact of the economy or the passing of legislation. Sure, local cable channels interview random citizens for the 11 o'clock news, but beyond that, there's no real discussion. So what do those Israelites do? What do we do when we want to make our voices heard? We ask questions of our parents, our friends, our legislators, our rabbis, our sages. We seek to understand so that we can then make ourselves heard. Whether it's in a public protest, a letter to the editor, or a Devar Torah to the synagogue, our voices are valuable and important. Even if we didn't hear the Israelites then, we can make sure our voices are heard now. It's up to us to speak and to make sure someone listens. Poignant and timely. Thank you to Rabbi Amelia Diamond. She's a school principal and youth director at Temple Beth Or in Raleigh, North Carolina. Stay tuned for Devar Heifer. A funny thing happened on the way to curse the children of Israel. That's the title of a portion I've written on before. You know, in some cultures, donkeys are revered as the smartest of animals, especially us talking ones. So said Eddie Murphy of the Donkey Shrek 2 character. The use of comedy in Jewish storytelling is actually a very powerful tool for conveying serious wisdom in our tradition. Often the Torah introduces to us a whole range of colorful characters, intriguing men, women, and creatures in order to infuse the stories of the Torah with wit and humor. These personalities have much to teach us about how our ancestors related to each other and to the world at large. Our Torah portion, Balak, on the surface, quite absurd. And still, words contained within it made their way into our liturgy. So the insights found in the narrative had great significance for our predecessors as they do for us today. And though funny, the messages found beneath the text this week elevate the foolishness of the story we read to a level of sageness. The humor of the tale is replaced at its core with prevailing and consistent lessons from our ancestors. Our words have power. Our speech is holy. All things that live communicate with us, and curses can be transformed into blessings. In the parashah, we read, a non-Israelite prophet named Balaam is called upon to curse the Israelites by the king of Moab, Balak. However, God says to Balaam, you shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for it is blessed. Numbers 22, verse 12. Giving into his greed, for Balak offered silver and gold, Balaam heads to the place where he's supposed to curse the children of Israel. And yet Balaam is stalled by his donkey, which refuses to follow his orders. The she-donkey saw the angel of God standing on the road and with his sword drawn in his hand, so the she-donkey turned away from the road and went into the field, and then Balaam struck the she-donkey to turn it back onto the road. Numbers 23, verse 23. Like an indigent teenager, the stubborn mule talks back to him. And when Balaam arrives at the place where he attempts to curse Israel, his mouth opens only to bless us. So Balak drags him to a different mountaintop. But again, Balaam only says what God desires, blessing the children of Israel a second time. Furious, Balak commands him to stop, saying, neither shall you curse them at all, nor shall you bless them at all. Numbers 23:25. But Balaam knew that God wanted him to bless Israel. So he offers this third most famous blessing. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Yisrael. On the surface, it's a silly story. But is it entirely ridiculous that animals speak in the tale? That a non-Israelite dialogues directly with God? that his curses come out as blessings? Our Parsha has serious messages to teach. One is that animals have keen senses, and they communicate with us all the time. Rashi and Rambam actually disagree regarding what the she-donkey saw. According to Rashi, animals are allowed to see spiritual beings that are blocked from the human eye, because human intelligence would cause people to live in constant fear if they could perceive everything around them. Rambam asserts that angels are not physical beings and cannot be seen by people or animals unless they assume human form, as when they visited Abraham, in which case they are visible to everyone. In Balaam's case, it was not that the she-donkey actually saw the angel. Rather, it sensed that it was in danger, for figuratively, a being with a drawn sword stood, before it. It's of no small significance that the Torah recognizes that there are prophets outside of Judaism. Yes, there are strong elements of particularism to this tale, such as how God favors the children of Israel. Even our own ancestors recognize that every religious community has its mystics. What makes the children of Israel remarkable is our willingness to receive the prophetic message. The success of any religious leader depends on how ready their community is to hear the message and follow through on it. Our ancestors were quick to say, "Let's do, and then we'll listen." Balaam's prophecy was meaningful because our people heard it, so much so that his words, "Ma tovu," open our daily prayer services. Finally, what about your life feels like a curse, like a dark cloud hanging over you? Is it something physical, financial, the loss of a relationship of a loved one? How might you change your perspective? Overcoming challenges can shape you into a stronger, more loving, more compassionate person. Those who focus only on the negative tend to only see the curses in their lives. By focusing on the positive, what you can learn from what is plaguing you helps you to see the blessings even in the challenges you're facing. So sometimes you have to strain to see even a slightly positive aspect in the current situation in this pandemic. But when you find it, grab it, right? Focus on it repeatedly throughout the day, day after day. And in time, you may come to know the blessings that are hidden beneath it. Shabbat Shalom. Hey, stay tuned. We'll do a little Haftarah to finish today. Something different. Instead of blessing and reading the text, I'm going to give a little synopsis and then a couple of insights from the tradition, because the Haftarah is from Micah. And so how can we not spend a little time with it? Micah lived roughly between 740 before the Common Era and 690 in the town of Moreshet in the southern kingdom. He probably lived in a small town in the foothills between Jerusalem and Gaza, actually, near Philistine cities. Country life is often evident in his images of farmers and shepherds. He would have been near enough to Jerusalem to be able to go and hear Isaiah's prophecies. He also could have been influenced by the contemporary teachings of Amos, who originated in a southern town, not far from Micah's hometown. And Micah, like Amos, pleads for justice. Micah focuses on many of the ills of his society. His main concern is with people who accumulate wealth at the cost of causing misery to the destitute masses. He implores his people to stop pursuing wealth, to end corrupt leadership, and live by God's demands of justice, mercy, and modesty. He warns the northern kingdom that they would be destroyed in his lifetime, as well as the southern kingdom. And in general, the book of Micah is divided into sort of three units. The first three chapters are sort of him condemning the Jewish people. The next two are consolations. And then 6 and 7 are kind of a mixture, the last two. And this Haftarah includes the end of the condemning passages and the beginning of the consolations. At the beginning of the Haftarah, Micah imagines a time in the future when Israel's enemies will be destroyed, a remnant of Israel will remain and will either be a blessing, like a dew, or a curse, like lions, to the surrounding nations. And, Micah then predicts God's destruction of all the devices, chariots, idols, The Israelites use in vain to strengthen themselves, and instead they need to learn to rely only on God and God's word. Next, God argues that throughout Israel's history, God has never caused them hardship, but has only helped them. God cites the exodus from slavery and the help of the prophetess Miriam and Moses and Aaron, and God also points out that he prevented the enemy Balak from having the prophet Balaam curse Israel. So the Israelites respond by admitting their need to repent, but question whether they could ever find a sacrificial offering that would be big enough and significant enough to warrant God's forgiveness. The people misunderstand what God wants from them. And Micah explains that all God really wants is this action of justice and this compassionate mercy that we could show and to modestly walk in his ways. So the text actually begins with verse 5 in chapter 10, where Micah says that God will destroy Israel's cities. It's interesting, according to the Talmud, it's better to live in a town anyway. In a city with walls, life is harder. So in what ways do you think city life is harder? In what ways is rural life better or harder? Cities today, as well as in Talmudic times, they suffer from things like air pollution. And so is air pollution a problem here in Nashville? We know we sit in this valley. As we move along in the text, in verse 6:3, God asks, "What hardships have I caused you?" So there's a midrash, Numbers Rabbah, says God always made the commandments easy to follow so as not to weary Israel. For example, God requests sacrificial animals, but always says to Israel, "I did not put you to any trouble. I did not bid you weary yourselves among the mountains in order to bring a sacrifice to me that those that run wild, but I asked only for domesticated animals." Right? Things you have in your own yard. So when we think about it, does God make sure that mitzvahs of sacrifice are hard or not hard? Are the mitzvot hard? There's more driving laws than there are mitzvot. We're just used to following them. Is it easy or difficult to follow mitzvot? Or really, is it easy or difficult to be a Jew, regardless of what mitzvot you follow? Not only does God ask, "What hardships have I caused you?" All right, in verse 6:4, God also points out that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were sent to Israel. And Leviticus Rabbah, a midrash, points out, sort of tells this parable. It says, "A king sent his messengers to a certain province, and the people of the province stood before them and served them food and drink with fear and trepidation." So similarly, God, says to Israel, "I sent you 3 messengers, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Did they, perchance, eat of what was yours? Did they drink of what was yours? Did they cause you any hardship? Is it not for their sake that you were maintained? The manna being for the sake of Moses, the well of water for the sake of Miriam, and the clouds of glory for the sake of Aaron?" So, in some ways, this midrash teaches that ordinary people have to work for a king and a staff, but God also sends prophets who work for the ordinary people. Similarly, in some ways today, we serve our leaders, and our leaders should serve us. Finally, in verse 6-8, Israel is told that one of the only things they have to do in order to please God is justice. Right? So according to Radak, doing justice means keeping all the laws and commandments involving relationships between one person and another. And since this teaching concludes that the main thing required by God is that one fulfill commandments involving other people, it suggests that the prime concern of religion is how people get along. So, this is a prime concern of religion. How people get along, and I'm proud, I am, that Micah has created a name for itself that reflects that sentiment. Verse 6-8 also says that instead of offering sacrifices, we should please God by walking modestly. And here again, the Radak phrases walking modestly with God by saying or teaching that a person's relationship with God, one's beliefs about God, or one's love for God, right, is private. It's unknown to anyone else, really. So should we keep that private? Is that always a private thing? I don't know. So in the end, I want to thank you, as always, for joining us as we examine the text of our tradition here in the month of July and are getting ready to move on next week to another Parsha. Shabbat Shalom. Hope it's a great day.